Hi, and welcome to this digital event, Reach Net Zero by Engaging Your Value Chain. We are going to dig into the how and the why to engage your value chain during the next hour. I'm Cassandra Julin. I'm head of PR and communications at Normative, and I will guide you through the next hour. We have a very exciting agenda today, but before getting started, let me run you through a couple of housekeeping rules. This webinar is recorded, so that means it will be available for you to share with friends and colleagues afterwards. If you have any further questions or would like to talk to one of our climate measuring or reduction experts, reach out to us at Normative. You can visit our website, normative.io. Before digging further into the program, let me tell you a couple of things about Normative. So now, the recent IPCC report makes it very clear we need to take climate action now. Normative was founded in 2014 for this specific purpose. This also makes Normative one of the first carbon emission accounting engines. Our software as a service helps businesses calculate their entire carbon footprint and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And we set a new scientific standard accuracy in emission accountancy, powered by our market-leading emission database. Normative aims to standardize the otherwise inconsistent, expensive, and people-intense process of carbon accounting. Our software as a service automates emission calculations by assessing all transactions and invoices, and we provide insights and guidance to companies on how to get to net zero. Gather your financial data and upload them to Normative. We map all your transactions, your invoices, and your supply chain, and calculate your carbon footprint. We highlight your emission hotspots and suggest the best initiatives with the greatest climate impact. And Normative shows you what initiatives have the greatest climate impact, and our experts help you devise a reduction roadmap and find high-quality climate investment for the emissions that you can't reduce. We work with businesses globally, internationally, and here are a few of our customers. And everything we do is based on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol as a global standard to ensure transparency. Normative is also the carbon accounting provider for the UN-backed SME Climate Hub, a part of the United Nations Race to Zero campaign, which aims to drive change to a decarbonized economy. Now, we know a little bit more about Normative. So let us welcome our first two guests. In this fireside chat, we have Christian Rönn, CEO and co-founder of Normative, and Anders Wijkman. You have several titles, but opinion leader, author, and honorary president of Club of Rome. Welcome. So let's start a little bit. Anders, can you tell us about your work with the Club of Rome and kind of your involvement?
Well, the Club of Rome is an international think tank. It was launched some 55 years ago and is mostly known for a report that was coming exactly 50 years ago, The Limits to Growth, which basically said that on a finite planet we cannot just continue to increase material consumption. And if we consume, we have to be much smarter than what we are today. And unfortunately, it was a wake-up call, but the world didn't listen much. So today we are in a very dire situation. We really have to do things in a different way, both with regard for climate change, but also because we are overutilizing ecosystems all over the world, whether we talk about forests, soils, or the oceans.
So still very relevant and true.
Absolutely.
Christian, this kind of goes back also to why you founded Normative a while back. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about the needs that you saw and kind of why you initiated the journey that we're on?
Yeah, so obviously the Limits to Growth book and report has been hugely inspirational to me and many other people. Reason why I decided to start Normative and leave my job at the University of Oxford was that I saw that in order to make a dent on climate change, business need to take their responsibility. And the first step of mitigating emissions is to measure your emissions, because in the end of the day, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And at that point in time, I thought, surely this is something that everyone is doing. Turned out that that was not the case. So that is the core reason why I started Normative, to make it simple for companies to mitigate and manage their carbon emissions.
And where are we today? Do you want to comment on Normative's mission and kind of where we're heading as an organization?
So I think we're on an exciting journey. So if you look at things historically, we kind of started out being focused on companies' Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, namely the emissions within their own operations. What we found out quite quickly after working with companies for many years is that in fact the majority of their emissions are not inside of their own operations, but inside their value chains. And it goes for almost all industries. I mean, obviously with some notable exceptions of, the kind of energy producing industry and logistics industries, it's mostly in scope 1, right? But most other industries are in scope 3. So now we're at a point in time when companies are setting net zero targets that applies both for their the emissions in their operations, but also in their value chain. And they need a trusted partner to help them on that journey of actually engaging their value chain and work together with them to go towards net zero emissions.
And going back to where we started as well, the IPCC report, it makes it very clear. We talked a little bit about it today, that the time to take action is now. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that? Why are we saying now? Why can't we postpone this? I mean, maybe the answer is obvious.
Because emissions accumulate. So even if we lower emissions today compared to next year, the total amount is increasing all the time. So that's why we have to be very drastic in our mitigation efforts. And I very much like your approach, because the value chain is about materials, it's about stuff. The neglected factor until now has been materials. We have focused all attention on fossil fuels, which of course is very, very, very understandable, because fossil fuels is still 80% of the energy mix in the world. But materials are the other side of the coin. And some of the materials are very, very much generators of carbon emissions. Steel, cement, textiles, electronics, plastics, to name some of the worst. And I'm a member of something called the International Resource Panel. We have made an estimate that the extraction and the processing of materials make up 50% of carbon emissions and 90% of biodiversity loss. So we talk about, of course, biomass, we talk about fossil fuels, we talk about minerals, we talk about metals. And all together, this is then an enormous challenge. And then you have to look at the value chain and see each and every step, and start with the extraction and then onwards.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit before we started this sending also about your recent report, tackling a little bit how the circular economy can kind of help to improve material flow and kind of the resources that we have. Do you want to comment slightly on that?
Well, circularity or circular, closing the loop, so to say. Using materials not once, but many, many times. And many of the materials can be used on and again. We don't have a system that facilitates that. On the contrary, our business models are linear, which means that we threw away a lot of money all the time when we don't use the materials more than once, and we generate more emissions, because if you reuse and recycle, emissions go down considerably. So that's why the business model has to be changed, and again, value chain is so important.
Yeah. And with the current legislation and policy frameworks, I mean, we have the Paris Agreement, we have the new legislation coming into force in Europe, which requires, 50,000 plus companies to start report on the legislation. The recent policy frameworks in the US and so on, everything is going in the kind of same direction to put more responsibility on businesses to start reporting on their emissions. What do you think about this? Is this the right way, and what's the kind of government's role in this compared to businesses alone?
Well, I think you said it. What gets measured gets done. So it's very important to know where you are so that you can not only put up a target but also understand whether you are moving towards your target. So I mean, the measurement and the indicators are incredibly important. And here I think there has to be a cooperation. It's the task of governments to put up the frameworks, and then for businesses to adopt to the frameworks. And there has to be a dialogue all the time. This is not something that you can do alone. You have to cooperate, in particular across the value chain.
And Christian, what's the driver or incentive for businesses to reduce their emission? I mean, for sure, the legislation is one leg of it, but what would you see kind of overall?
It has to happen sooner rather than later, and it is one of the biggest business opportunities in the world right now. I mean, there is the opportunity of increased brand equity from actually taking climate change seriously. There is cost of capital and getting a hold of capital, and I think the core point is that especially decarbonizing value chains. For a large business, this is going to take many years. So you better start now, and then you can reap the rewards early on. You talked about circular economy earlier. I mean, it is, in the long run, cheaper and more sustainable for the business to run in a circular fashion. And the way to do it is through the value chains, because in the end, we have a planet with limited resources. So if you run your business on non-sustainable models, you're not going to be around for a long time.
No, you may be around for the short term, but not for the long term. And the problem is that our economy is very short term oriented. So that is also one aspect where politicians have to do something and help us to move towards a more long-term oriented system. Then I think also we can trust that the price of carbon will increase step by step by step, and then the cost for the company who has not addressed the carbon emissions will increase all the time. So there are so many aspects of this which all point in the same direction. And then finally, if I were a CEO, if I worked in a company, I would be very pleased if I knew that I didn't contribute to an increasing problem in terms of climate change, but rather the opposite, and help the world to adjust.
Yeah. And I think the financial risk is a very important point from a perspective that carbon is not expected to get cheaper. And if you build up, like you talked about in the beginning, the accumulation of, your carbon footprint, you have more to address later. So, you're just pushing the problem forward. We do have the UN conference Stockholm Plus 50 coming to Stockholm in June this summer, and that marks the 50th anniversary of global climate action. What would you like to see coming out of that conference, and what would you kind of hoping for that leaders would push for?
I had great hopes a year ago. My hopes today are not so great, because I haven't seen that the UN, in cooperation with the Swedish government, has done enough in terms of preparations. I don't think there's going to be a final resolution with some commitments. There is more going to be like a talk club, but I hope I'm wrong. Of course, what is also complicating the situation is the war in Ukraine. It's difficult to talk about anything long term when people are being massacred the way they are by Putin and his war. So I don't think we should have too high expectations. But I think if I had one wish, it is for the international community to recognize that since 1972 we have achieved very little. So we are now in dire straits. So we have to tell the truth and then really accelerate in terms of action. That to me, it would be the most important thing, and not the opposite. That ministers stand up and say, "Oh, we have done this and we have done that." Yes, they have done a few things, quite a number of things, some of them, but not enough, because all the indicators are pointing in the wrong direction.
Truth is indeed very important. Let's hope we see a little bit more of that coming from governments going forward. Christian, why do we speak about value chains in these discussions? Just a final remark. I mean, supply chain is another word going around, but why is this so important?
So I think value chain and supply chains are obviously important. We choose to use the word value chain in particular to be a bit more inclusive, because it doesn't have to be necessarily the flow of physical goods. I think, for instance, for the financial industry and their value chains, they have an incredibly important role to play to actually make sure that money is being moved into the latest technologies that will enable the decarbonization. So again, and it's the same pattern. It doesn't matter if you're a large bank or if you are a retail company. A big chunk, and usually over 90% of emissions are in that value chain, and you have responsibility for it. You have responsibility for your suppliers. You have responsibility in what companies and technologies you invest in the end of the day.
Thank you. So thank you to our panel, Anders and Christian, for sharing your insights with us. At Normative, today is quite a special day for us. We're launching the guide that we mentioned, Enterprise Value Chain Carbon Emission Reduction. We hope that this guide will help businesses start to get measure and reducing their emissions and stay compliant both with legislation and stay competitive on the market. So with that, I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Alexander Schmidt, who's heading Science and Climate Research at Normative, who will give you a deep dive into the guide. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you, Cassandra. I'm excited to present you today the results of our research of our guide to reduce your value chain's carbon emissions. Now, I guess the first part that kind of, captures your attention is why did we focus on value chain emissions to begin with? Now, let me park this question for a moment. I promise I'll come back to this in maybe 3 minutes. But first, let us zoom out a bit in general on the topic of emissions, because I do feel it is important that we set the context right. And the truth is, right now, we're just not on track. We have to dramatically bend the curve of emissions to stay on track with the Paris Agreement, with the Paris commitment that has committed us to keep global warming to a level of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And for this, we need to all work together to bend this curve to, as a few ballpoints figures there, we need to halve emissions by 2030, and we need to reach a net zero by 2050. And a quick side note on the net zero, so we will not get to a big fat zero in total. We will have to compensate residual emissions by certain carbon removals. So that's where the net zero is coming from that we're often referring to here. So what does this mean, this carbon law of halving emissions by 2030 and going net zero by 2050? It means that especially the private sector needs to do its part. Companies, they do account for a big bulk of the overall emissions, and if we don't get them on board, we have honestly no chance of reaching net zero by 2050. So that's the context. Still, what does it mean now for the companies? So where should they start? That's, I guess, the question that many companies will ask themselves. Luckily, some of them have already started to address this question. And usually, the first straightforward step is to look into your own facilities. What is happening at my production sites? What goes into the vehicle fleet that helps me to deliver my goods? This is usually referred to then your Scope 1 emissions, in addition to what did I buy in terms of electricity that goes again into my direct operations, Scope 2 emissions. Luckily, many companies already do tackle those emissions. They do account for their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions and have started to take the first actions there, which is great. But, and that is unfortunately a big fat but, we have to do more. we have to do more to really reduce our global emissions, and every company to reduce their own emissions, because there's this problem of indirect emissions, meaning those that emerge from your value chain. And those for a typical company, and that's really sad to hear, are usually around 90% or more of your overall emissions. So without those emissions, there is no chance we can get to a net zero. And that's coming back to my initial, or the opening question that I parked for a minute, it refers to the value chain emissions. So we have put out this guide to help companies to get started on their value chain emissions, because without those, there's no way we can make meaningful progress. So we have set the context. We have looked into, why value chain emissions are important. Then again, as a company, you might say, well, that's good. I realize this, I recognize this. I want to do something. But how? Help me. Like, how can I take the first step? So that's why we put together a simple 4-step guide. And when I say we, it's really important to emphasize there are already a lot of parties, organizations out there that did produce valuable research, valuable output, valuable guidelines. So we're definitely building upon things we have found. The problem, again, quote unquote, here is that many of those guidelines are quite specific for industries, for sectors, for certain initiatives. However, we feel it's so important that you embed this into an overall picture, an overall roadmap for your company. Otherwise, there's no way you can, make meaningful progress, but only progress in certain areas. So our first 4-step guide, high level, but hopefully very actionable for companies and broadly applicable, starts with the get support part. I mentioned before, there are, services, but also guidelines out there that can help you. There are experts out there that can help you to get, started on the path of reducing your emissions. But when we talk about emissions, it's of course important to actually know what are my emissions. Otherwise, how could I possibly start to reduce my emissions? If you do not measure them, how can you possibly manage them? Or if you don't measure them, they will ultimately become a business liability for you and your company. So establishing your baseline, putting everything on the table, and that's something that no one should be afraid of. There's no shame in having like high scope 3 emissions. That is all fine. What would be a shame is if you fail to act on those and fail to reduce those emissions. So measuring, baselining, and knowing where you stand is super important. The next step then would be to actually plan. So what is my strategy here? How do I engage my suppliers? How do I communicate with customers? A lot of things that have to happen there. And let us put a small bookmark into this one. I will come back to it in a few minutes, just to get a few more actionable guidelines on what you can do in this planning and execution step. Very, very important. This is not a one and done thing. You have to follow up. If you do not engage, continuously with your company, organization, suppliers, customers, it will not be very fruitful. It would be a one-time, very nice to have, but it will not really move the needle. So it's super important that you follow up, that you stay on track of what's happening there. So this is the context of a simple 4-step guide for companies to start to address their value chain emissions. Now, let us zoom in on the planning step, because what we often hear is actions, so missing actions or lack of knowledge about what actually can I do to start move the needle here. And while the entire value chain is relevant in this context, it is also for most companies, especially for large enterprises, the case that suppliers or the supply chain is responsible for the majority of your emissions in the value chain. So what we put together is an overview, a guideline again, about supply chain engagement or supplier engagement. How can you start to move the needle in those areas where it matters the most? And here's already the first step. Where does it matter the most? Well, you have to, of course, do the analysis with your measurement data. So the focus is super important. Focus on those suppliers that actually can move the needle. Also realize some suppliers might not be ready yet. That cannot be an excuse forever, but it might be that you do want to tackle first suppliers that are actually, ready to go with you together. The second step then is that you have to plan the right strategy. It's not just sending out a memo saying, hey, supplier X, you need to do something. tell us when you're done. You need to have an actionable plan there. The plan can, of course, go from very informative. So you send out materials, send out information, you inform them that you are planning on doing this initiative, to, on the other end of the spectrum, actively enforcing. So you say, we as company X, we have a policy now, or in 1 or 2 years, we will not accept suppliers that do not adhere to our sustainability policy. So this can be then the actively enforcing approach. However, we do not encourage you to just, again, send out a letter and informing them you're kind of on the red list now. Don't act on this, otherwise you're going to be dismissed. No, you have to communicate. Communicate not only what you do, so not only we need this because it's important for our company, but also what is in there for them. Make clear this is a mutually beneficial, or can be a mutually beneficial thing to do together. So communicate the goals that you set out to achieve with this, and goals that are reasonable for that supplier to achieve as well. The next step, let's just imagine you have suppliers, they understand this, they're ready for this, they want to go. But again, what to do? What is the action that they can take? That is a big problem for them. So encouragement is super important. We from Normative, with the amazing help from Google.org and our fellowship, we, for example, brought out a free carbon calculator that is featured on the UN Race to Zero's SME Climate Hub. That is one of the resources you can tap into, right? Encourage your supplier to go to this free resource, calculate. There are other guides and tools out there that can help you in a similar fashion. So help them to take the first step. Otherwise, they might, fall into certain inertia and it can't really move forward. Once you've encouraged them, or once you've, started to see some movement, it's relevant that you keep monitoring it. Monitoring might have a negative, connotation to it. It's not meant like this at all. It is really an ongoing encouragement, you can say. Look at what has happened, look at why something might have not happened, and then see how you can, further adjust in your plan and strategy to help the entire supply chain to move towards the common goal of reaching net zero emissions. And with that being said, let me just quickly summarize. I of course, encourage you to look into the entire report. Let me just quickly summarize there what is the key takeaway here, and especially this question, which we also often get asked: why is it something that is relevant right now? Why is it something that you should be engaging with right now? The truth on the first point is that, well, it is not news that climate, we have to take action on our carbon emissions. Unfortunately, we have failed so far to take actions. We do see in recent years there is a renewed urgency and also a more willingness by leaders to take those first steps, which is very encouraging, but we need more of this globally to get to this net zero goal and to meet the Paris Agreement commitment. On the other side, there will also be a push factor from regulations. So you will, depending on where you are and which jurisdiction, you will be, subject to more and more regulations that will require you to report, to measure, and to show that you have an action plan in place, referring back to the business liability. But to end on a more positive note, there's also opportunity for you there. There is a big, push right now in the market for more sustainability. Your customers will appreciate it. You will attract more talent. And hopefully also you will, together with your suppliers, be able to create some kind of like a positive self-reinforcing mechanism to support each other and to create real business value out of this. That's the overview of the report, and again, there's much more in it, but that is just to give you an outline of what you can expect to find in there.
Thank you, Alex. So was there anything that surprised you in this report when you were kind of at the crafting table?
Surprise, well, I think there are a few things that we should really highlight. And again, maybe coming back to this positive note, the network effects. I think this is really, really important to realize that you can really create momentum. At the beginning, it might be a bit, you need to have a certain start energy to get going. But once you have kind of overcome that, you can really create momentum and get the ball rolling. And, one supplier motivates the other one. And this can really, really, lead to a snowball effect in a positive sense. So that's, I think, very encouraging.
Yeah. Why have we chosen to focus on supply chain and enterprises specifically in this report? Is there a specific reason for that?
Yeah, I think this also comes back to on one hand, yeah, it can be a bit discouraging if you see, what we showed there with the big scope 3 emissions, where to start. It's indirect, so I cannot just, turn off a pipe and I'm done. We have to go and communicate and engage. And especially the larger the organization, the larger usually the value chains, the supply chains. So to make progress, meaningful progress there, I really believe you do need help for bodies, institutions that are focused on this subject.
Yeah. I mean, you're head of science and climate research at Normative, and you're tackling very complex issues on an everyday basis. And this subject is for sure a very hard one to digest and quite difficult for companies to tackle. How do you think this report will add value to enterprises that wants to reduce their emissions?
Yeah, I think exactly that's the point around trying to reduce a complex topic to the basics. Coming back to the climate science is clear. I mean, there's not much we can do about it, so to speak. The problem really is that we need to make it easy for companies to take the first steps there. So especially with this supplier engagement overview framework that we put together, this is meant to make it really easy for companies to just say, okay, focus, strategize, communicate, engage, monitor, to make it a fluent process for them and to kind of lower the entry barriers that might otherwise keep them from just taking the first step.
That's a very important point, to lower the barriers. So in your opinion, who should read this report?
I do believe, given the breadth of the report, it's really something that everyone can get something out of it. So be it, of course, the large enterprises, the companies themselves, the suppliers to prepare themselves for what is going to, what is rolling at them, so to speak. The regulators to look into what frameworks are there. Maybe also they can put, guidelines attached to regulations, so to speak, and consumers, because they also want to know what's going on and how might I be able to encourage the companies from which I buy products and services to encourage to be more sustainable.
So I interpret that everyone.
Yes.
And it's completely free, so that's the good news to
Definitely.
download. Thank you, Alex.
Very welcome.
Moving on to the next session, we are joined here by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 experts, having to count for the next 25 minutes or so. We will be tackling the topic together of engaging the 90% of your emission, which means the value chain. So starting here on my side, we have Athanasia Seros. She's Director of Environmental Sustainability at MasterCard. We have Tyler Christie. He's founder at Natural Capital Advisor and advisor at EQT and Seedcamp. We have Eva Dalenstam. She's Policy Officer Circular Economy at DG Envy at the European Commission. And we have Christian and Alexander. So welcome, everyone. Athanasia, you were interviewed for the report from MasterCard's perspective. I'd be very interested to hear a little bit more about your sustainability and reporting work. Do you want to give us a few words on that?
Sure, absolutely, love to. So here at MasterCard, we have kind of been looking at our value chain and kind of the way that we're looking at our greenhouse gas emissions today in 2016. That was really our first year that we took the step back and said, okay, a true greenhouse gas inventory reporting is going to be scope 1, 2, and scope 3. So that was kind of our first, I want to say, step into the scope 3 world where everything was a little bit more new and different. So we've been doing that since 2016. In 2018, we set our first science-based target to reduce our entire emissions along our value chain. We have now from there reset them to align with 1.5. Now we actually have a net zero goal for 2040 that includes our entire value chain, which includes our scope 1, 2, and 3. So reduction of 90% by 2040 with 10% relying on carbon offsets. We've been reporting and working with our suppliers and our entire value chain since 2016.
Thank you. And I have a follow-up question as well. In the report, we asked you how your value chain engagement factors into your net zero strategies. You kind of touched upon that. Can you comment a little bit about the net zero strategies further?
Yeah, absolutely. As many organizations that are not energy or manufacturing, 80% of all of our greenhouse gas emissions fall within our scope 3. 80% of those are actually our supply chain. Because we are a technology company, we do not manufacture any goods, so the majority of that's going to be in our supply chain. We know that in order for us to get to net zero, we have to engage our suppliers and we have to partner with them. There's no way for us to successfully reduce our greenhouse gas emissions without their, I want to say, agreement, their help, and their commitment as well. So we have an active program of engaging our suppliers. So first, we have what we call it's a multi-tier approach. So we are approaching suppliers where they are in their journey. So we have suppliers who have never even looked at greenhouse gas emissions, who never looked at environmental sustainability. We kind of engage with them to start getting their footprint understood, to start even benchmarking, to start measuring, even if it's not the most accurate way because, data is unknown or things are estimated. We work with them to start getting them, to look at that, all the way to setting targets, getting renewable energy, all of the way to what we call collaborations. So collaborations are ways that we can engage directly with our suppliers on specific projects to help reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So that's kind of how we engage with our entire value chain, and we've been quite successful so far. We've reduced our Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions by 54% from 2016.
That's very impressive. Just another quick follow-up question. Do you meet a lot of resistance in your value chain to take climate action and kind of measure and reduce, or is it generally positively received?
We generally have a positive response. One of the things that I would say is negative is the unknown. Of course, at MasterCard, we have a team, right? So there's myself, there's a team who's looking at this, who's reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. When you're approaching some suppliers, especially those who are small, medium-sized enterprises, they don't have a team. This seems like something that is such a large undertaking that they just do not see how they would be successfully able to do so. So I would say it's not necessarily resistance, but it's more unknowing of how they're going to be able to get to where they need to be without the team. And that's kind of where we've set up our program, is we help them along, kind of guide them to report, to start their journey, to give them a possibility to see that it's not a ginormous undertaking. And that's kind of how we've been successful at it.
Thank you. Eva, you're a policy officer, circular economy. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your work at the European Commission and the kind of involvement in circular economy and how, the basics of circular economy? I guess there are a few here in this webinar that would be new to this concept.
Yes, thank you. Well, I work in the circular economy unit of DG Environment at the European Commission. And I work with the implementation of the EU Circular Economy Action Plan, and specifically also with the nexus between circular economy and climate change mitigation and adaptation, and circular economy and biodiversity. So a bit shortly about circular economy. It's an economy where products are retained at as high value as possible for as long as possible, and where waste is minimized. So it encompasses such measures such as reuse, repair, refurbish, remanufacture, recycle, resource efficiency, and more. And these types of measures, of course, they affect the value chain. So the value chain is more of a loop in a circular economy, where products then are kept for as long as possible in the economy via, for instance, reuse, and materials are kept for as long as possible via recycling. So in a circular economy, products' lifetimes are extended as much as possible, so they are durable, easy to repair, or easy to upgrade, etc. And in a circular economy, materials are made to be recyclable, so you can easily recycle them at their end of life. And these durability, reusability, upgradability, etc., can be facilitated by these circular business models, such as renting, leasing, etc.
Yeah. Alex, we talked as well with Christian and with Anders about the circular economy and the role of kind of value chain. In the report, we tackle also, how to identify, you need to look at the hotspots, you need to look at the bigger picture. What's your take on kind of how to do a few quick reductions, what would you say are the kind of quick fixes in the value chain, if there are any, from like a circular perspective?
Very interesting. I must admit, I don't think there are super quick fixes. It will always be a bit of a long game. But I do think it's important to focus on those spots, those hot spots, the way you can really move the needle. Otherwise, it might lead to frustration when you have engaged 10 suppliers, but then you look afterwards again at your emissions, and they didn't really move a lot because you focus on the wrong suppliers. So even though there are no quick fixes, I do strongly believe there are a lot of prioritization should be done around what should be tackled first in order to make progress as quickly as possible.
Tyler, bringing you as well into the discussion here, tell us a little bit more about your background. You obviously have a bunch of titles. And then also, what is your take on industry's role on tackling climate change from the background that you have?
Yeah, certainly. So interestingly enough, I was an investor in what's called the Clean Tech 1.0 cycle from back in sort of 2008 to 2011 period. And so then also lived through what's then called the climate tech winter, many years where there was underinvestment in this. And but during that time, I actually ran a company that did carbon accounting for many of the largest enterprises in the UK. So and where we focused on value chain engagement, and so deeply understand the sector and challenges, and have this benefit of history of seeing how it has waxed and waned. I think right now the onus is really on industry to not make excuses about what government should or could be doing. We have so many of the available technologies right now for companies to decarbonize. And I think for many large companies, whether they're consumer facing or heavy emitting industrials, the opportunity is now to seize this moment and really support the adoption of the technologies that we do have to decarbonize as quickly as possible. I think the companies that are not doing that are going to miss out on that opportunity, become more competitive, and will also face increasing risks from their reputation and business profile and access to capital. So not only, like, I completely agree with Christian, not only is an opportunity, but it's an imperative. And I think many companies are waking up to that fact. So I'm excited for this opportunity that we see right now.
Yeah, thank you. And touching a little bit on what was said before on the kind of biggest blocker for industries to tackle their value chain emissions, we saw a recent study from the SME Climate Hub that stated that lack of resources and knowledge was the very biggest reason for businesses not to take action, and it very much resonates with what was just said. Christian, do you think this is true across businesses of all sizes, or is this a smaller business problem or a value chain problem, or what's your take on this?
I think it's a general value chain problem. I mean, for most businesses, you kind of have this long tail of emissions in your, SME suppliers or SME customers, and for that segment, you really need to be more engaged to actually help them. Here are the tools and resources to account for your carbon emissions, and here are the actions that you can take, and be a supporting hand in engaging them. So it's very much different if you engage that long tail versus the large enterprise suppliers, because they are more mature, they have more resources to tackle this to begin with. But back to what Alex said earlier, I mean, that is one of the reasons why we started the SME Climate Hub with the Exponential Roadmap Initiative, Women Business Coalition, and UN Race to Zero campaign, to help kind of solve that problem of engaging that long tail. And on the point on what you can do in the value chain, I mean, there is obviously simpler things and harder things, but something that everyone can do is at least, push for renewable electricity where it exists, push for implementation of existing technologies, whether or not it might be, implementation of electrification in your vehicle fleets and so on. So there's always a bunch of things that you can do in order to engage with your value chain and even the SMEs. And I think that is what we have proven as of lately.
And now I think, if I understand correctly, you addressed a lot of the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions within the value chain. So the value chain is your scope 3 emissions, but the electricity is actually the scope 1 emissions. So if we are to dig into, the value chain emissions, we're getting into trickier parts of the conversation. Or did I misunderstand you?
So I think some concepts here. So if you take my scope 3 emissions, let's say I'm a large enterprise and I'm buying a bunch of things that I'm then reselling, then my scope 3 emissions is actually the scope 1 emissions of my entire value chain, or the scope 1 plus scope 2, depending on how you kind of slice things. And I think in the end, to have high resolution data, you need to kind of move up the value chain and say you should start caring about your scope 1 and scope 2, and the way for you to care about your scope 3 is actually inviting someone else to care about their scope 1 and scope 2. So I mean that is the type of chain letter, if you will, that I think we need to have in order to tackle especially that long tail of emissions.
Thank you. Because in essence, everyone is part of some sort of value chain at some level.
Yes.
Alex, there's also some tips in the report, very much focusing on tackling what you actually can affect, the kind of strategic approach to it. Do you want to comment on that? I mean, one of the feedback that we've heard from one of our customers is, there are a lot of things they can't control in the value chain, but there are some things that they can, such as material use and so on. Do you want to share some insight on that?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if we look at the enterprise level that wants to engage their value chain, what I sketch out very briefly just, and you find more details, of course, in the report, there's a range of options for you. You can really be more on the informative side, meaning here's what you can do, electricity, vehicle fleet, supplier, please, it would be nice if you could take action there. And you can go all the way at the end of the spectrum saying, enforcing it, saying we have a new policy, from that year onwards, we just do not accept any more suppliers that do not adhere to this policy. And there are, of course, different shades of gray in between, but there's a range here. So you have different options, and it might also make sense to tailor the options that you are using or the strategy that you're using to the supplier at hand. Maybe you have good relationships with them. Maybe you know what they're struggling with, and then you want to be more informative, supportive, or you have barely any influence, so you want to be more restrictive, meaning if you want to continue doing business with us, this is what you have to adhere to from 2020X onwards, because otherwise we can't do business with you anymore.
Yeah. Eva, we talked about the circular economy and the kind of impact. How can a circular economy reduce climate impact for value chains? Like, what's the direct effects, so to say, of applying a more circular mindset to reducing value chain emissions?
Yes, and this has to do with the value of products and to keep them at as a high value as possible for as long as possible in the economy, so that waste is minimized. Because in that sense, we avoid the incineration and landfill, which releases both CO2 emissions and methane. Also, in a circular economy, we avoid production of new products or of new raw materials when we use the products we've already got over and over again, or we use recycled materials instead of virgin materials. So I can give you some examples. For instance, textiles, which also Anders mentioned, and the largest share of greenhouse gas emissions take place in the production. So for instance, a circular economy measure such as reuse, using your garment for twice as long can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40 to 49%. In the automotive sector, if you remanufacture the automotive engine, you can save 73 to 87% of the CO2 emissions. And we have also studies showing how recycling of intermediary products such as steel, plastics, aluminum, and cement could reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 46%. And I have many more examples, but I don't know how much time I have to tell you all about them.
But I think those are great examples to highlight kind of how it all comes into place. There's also a lot of stuff going on from the European Commission in terms of circular economy that affects businesses across Europe. Do you want to highlight what some of those initiatives are?
Yes, of course. The whole circular economy action plan that we're working with its aim is to reduce our carbon and material footprint. So just recently, we presented the Sustainable Products Initiative with the new Eco-Design for Sustainable Products regulation, which will be applied to all products put on the EU market. Also, the Circular Economy Action Plan targets several key product value chains, such as textiles, intermediate products such as steel, electronics, plastics, construction, and more. Also, the Commission is currently conducting a study on the contribution of circular economy to EU climate policies. And this involves using LCA data, so life cycle analysis, a robust and transparent methodology called the Product Environmental Footprint Methodology, and then combining that with the macroeconomic model in order to identify the greenhouse gas emissions reduction potential from both individual or combined circular economy measures in a specific sector or several sectors, because it can be cross-sectorial, of course, when it comes to circular economy, and at looking at different measures along the value chain. So this could be quite interesting for you to know about and to be able to use. And just let me get back to this PEF, the Product Environmental Footprint Methodology. It's a methodology developed by the Commission and it covers 16 environmental impact categories, and one of them is climate change. And thus you can calculate the carbon footprint of your product. You can also calculate the effects of recycling. It can be quantified in this methodology with the circular footprint formula, and you can quantify the effects of reuse in this methodology with the extension of lifetime, which is part of the functional unit. Also, this PEF methodology that the Commission is working with is becoming more and more used in EC policies. So just to give some examples, it's used as the threshold of classes of performance for products in the carbon footprint thresholds by the Batteries Regulation proposal. It's tracking environmental performance in the taxonomy regulation. It's used in this study for climate change mitigation, which I told you about. It's used for hotspot identification in eco-labeling, and for communication of environmental profile and labeling reporting as options in the upcoming Green Claims Initiative.
Thank you. A lot of stuff going on, actually. There's no rest for the climate, but it's a trend that we discussed and we talked about a little bit across this hour, that legislation is going towards one direction, and it is more to measure, to reduce, to keep track of your emissions, to hold businesses and products accountable for the emissions that they emit. Tyler, what do you think is a driver for businesses to take climate action? What in your opinion, is it legislation, or is it to do the good thing, or what would you say is the main pusher?
It'd be easy to say one silver bullet for all. I hope that all of these, multitude of factors are driving businesses, and I've seen that through my own experience. Often put it into a couple of following categories, whether it's investor demand or supplier or customer demand, potentially also suppliers, but in the value chain pressure, and then employees. And you see kind of different degrees of pressure from each for different types of companies and different industries. Publicly traded companies will face more pressure from investor stakeholders, and certain industries may face more pressure from employees even. So I do think employees is a really interesting lever of action. It's one that we all can take, and I think increasingly a large percentage of our economy is dependent on companies that are in the knowledge sector, and they rely on the best talent. And I think increasingly companies are recognizing that to retain the best talent, they need to align their actions with values that people care about. And so I do think for broad sectors, especially say the technology industry, services, this is an increasingly important lever, and one that we can all play a role in. So I think that is one not to overlook, importantly.
Yeah. Athanasia, I mean, obviously having done a lot of hands-on work on value chain emission reduction that you can read more about in the report, but can you give us a few examples? What's the most tricky for you with working with value chain emission reductions? What are like the biggest hurdles in tackling this subject?
Well, I think one is the most challenging is data, accuracy of data, right? A lot of what you're doing in your greenhouse gas emissions and your full emissions kind of in general along your scope 3, if your supplier is not reporting their greenhouse gas emissions, you have to use averages. The data isn't necessarily accurate, so that's the first and most challenging, is continuing to get accurate greenhouse gas emission data for your value chain and your supply chain, but that's not something that should stop you. And I would say from an engagement standpoint, it's actually one of the most challenging, is to understand what would be most beneficial for your suppliers as well as yourself. And then the next step is actually how to calculate that. How do you accurately calculate the collaborations that you've done with your suppliers to account for them in your greenhouse gas emissions? I would say those are the two most challenging parts of engaging with your value chain, outside of the actual effort into engaging and talking with suppliers and getting them on board. But when you get them on board, those would be the two I would say most challenging, is data accuracy and getting everyone on one speed, and then how to actually account for the positive collaborations and what we call handprints you're working with for your suppliers.
Yeah. And just to bring a little bit more clarification, can you give examples of a couple of your value chains? Like do they actually look like? Who are they?
Sure. So our value chain is like many value chains. We are a technology company, so we are not necessarily engaging suppliers who are very emissions heavy, just like we are ourselves. The majority of our suppliers are people in the technology space, advertising and marketing. I would like to say real estate. Those are our top three, actually. Operations and technology, advertising and marketing, and real estate are our top three supply chain categories. So most of the people and suppliers that we're working with are not the heavy contributors. Their majority of their greenhouse gas emissions are also going to be in their value chain, in their scope 3. So those are a lot of what we're working with, is how to have them start their supply chain and value chain emissions work as well. We can help, do things like investing in renewable energy. We can help them start looking at decarbonizing their operations, but the majority of where we're going to see the most reduction is within their supply chains and even their supplier supply chain, because many of them are going to fall along the same lines that we are. Their supply chain is going to be majority of people with small operational emissions and larger supply chains.
Thank you for that insight. Time flies and we're coming towards the end of this hour, but before wrapping up, I'd like to go around the table and ask our panelists, what is your key recommendation for businesses that want to reduce their value chain emissions? So maybe starting with you, Atanasia.
Sure, and I think this is what we hear when we are engaging with our suppliers, is your first attempt does not have to be perfect. Everybody wants to have a full understanding of their greenhouse gas emissions, especially the data is not accurate. They have to make estimations. Things are based on spend, not necessarily allocated data. And my biggest recommendation is you have to start somewhere, and starting with an estimate is better than accurate. And as you continue down your journey and your organization's journey, you can successfully start making those estimates better, and you can start actually engaging in reducing those supply chain emissions. And that's where everyone really needs to be. So don't be afraid of the unknown.
Thank you. Tyler.
I mean, to truly own the carbon liability in your value chain as if it's on your balance sheet, and invest accordingly. So companies were to quantify their scope 3 and view it as a true carbon liability with a price, then that they would either have to expense in a net zero situation through offsets and removals. That would drive their attention towards proactively putting money to work, investing and reducing that footprint. And that's exactly what companies should be doing. So, we have a lot of technology available. We need more and more companies to invest in adopting that and finding new ways to innovate to accelerate that adoption. So I'd like companies to really own that challenge and invest accordingly.
Thank you. Eva.
Yeah, we'll see if my voice holds here. But I think that it's important to look from a life cycle perspective, because that's the value chain. You look at the whole life cycle of your organization and your products, and there you can do a hot spot analysis. So look at the hot spots of your emissions and tackle those first.
Thank you. Alex.
Yeah, I mean, we just heard don't be afraid of the unknown. Of course, we and here with our team, we hope to make the unknown a bit less unknown and a bit less scary through guides that we put out, like the ones we put out here. So hopefully more data-driven research and actionable recommendations, more collaborations, and more conversions in the market towards standards and norms.
And Christian.
I would say that climate change doesn't wait for us. So businesses need to be courageous. And that means not being, letting perfection being the enemy of good, to some of the points earlier. I mean, get out there, try to map your value chain, try to make a hotspot analysis of it, have a life cycle approach to the way you look at things, and just take action now, because, I mean, climate change is not stopping.
Thank you. So thank you to our panelists here today. So short summary of the discussions that we've had right now. Value chain or scope 3 emissions is, it's the iceberg. So if you're only looking at your scope 1 and 2 emissions, it's only the tip of the iceberg. So to make real climate impact, this is something that your business will need to tackle. The full report is available for download for free on our website, normative.io. We recorded this session for you, so it's available to watch on demand as many times as you like. If you want to talk to one of our climate experts and reduction experts, feel free to reach out to us. We'll be happy to talk to you. And with that, I'd like to thank you all and wish you a nice day.